Sometimes we think our story is over when love walks out the door for the last time. Sometimes we accept that our best years are behind us and all that remains is waiting for the end. 58-year-old healer Elira thought exactly that as she stood bound with rope during the blood moon gathering. Her village offered her as sacrifice to the vampire lords who rule the dark woods. She had made peace with death. But when the most powerful vampire, Lord Theran, emerges from the mist, he stops the ceremony. He claims Elira as his own, not as prey, but as someone he remembers from long ago. Their connection awakens feelings she thought were buried with her husband. What happens when a woman discovers her greatest love story might just be beginning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sacred hemp rope that bound Elira's wrists had been, blessed by Father Benedict himself, soaked in holy water and sanctified with prayers that were older than the village stones. As she stood in the center of the moonlit clearing, feeling the coarse fibers against her weathered skin, she found an odd comfort in their weight. These bindings represented more than mere restraint. They were the final thread connecting her to a life she had long grown weary of carrying. Elira Morwen had been the village healer for 37 years, ever since she'd married Thomas and moved to this remote settlement nestled against the thornwood forest. Her worn leather satchel, now resting beside the sacrificial altar, had accompanied her through countless births, deaths, and everything in between. Its compartments held dried chamomile for calming nerves, willow bark for pain, and feverfew for headaches that came with too much thinking about what might have been. The bag bore the scars of its service, stains from blood and birthing fluid, burn marks from hurried midnight calls, and scratches from thorns encountered while gathering herbs in dangerous places. At 58, Elira had delivered 3 generations of babies, closed the eyes of their grandparents, and mended every manner of wound that life in a frontier village could inflict. Her hands, now marked with liver spots and fine lines, had pulled children from the brink of fever dreams and guided laboring mothers through the valley of shadows. Yet for all her skill at preserving life, she had failed at the one healing that mattered most. Thomas had died 5 winters ago, taken by a wasting sickness that laughed at her herbs and rendered her knowledge useless. She had sat beside his bed for weeks, watching the man who had shared her life fade like morning mist. His last words still echoed in the quiet moments. "Don't follow me too quickly, love. There's still good work left for you to do." But Thomas had been wrong about that. The work felt hollow now, mechanical movements, without the warmth that had once driven her purpose. The village of Millhaven existed in the shadow of ancient fears. Beyond the protective circle of blessed stones that marked their boundary, the thornwood stretched dark and endless. Local legend claimed that vampire lords ruled those depths, creatures so old they remembered when the world was young. Every generation, when the blood moon rose full and crimson, the village would select someone to offer as tribute. It was an ancient compact. They believed one life to spare many. Usually they chose someone already dying, someone whose passing would be a mercy rather than a tragedy. This year, Elira had volunteered herself, not from any noble desire for sacrifice, but from simple weariness. At the village assembly 3 nights ago, when Elder Matthias had called for candidates, she had stood with the quiet dignity that had carried her through her husband's funeral. "I offer myself," she had said, her voice steady as stone. "My childbearing years are long past. My husband waits for me in whatever comes after, and this old body grows tired of its burdens." The silence that followed had been profound. Young mothers clutched their children closer. Men removed their caps in respect. Even the skeptics, those who whispered that the vampire lords were merely stories to frighten children, found themselves unable to meet her eyes. Elder Matthias, whose own wife had been the previous healer before Elira, had tears in his weathered eyes. "Elira," You have given this village more than any one person should. We cannot ask this of you." "You didn't ask," she had replied simply. "I offered." "There's a difference." Her apprentice, 23-year-old Mira, had pleaded with her afterward. The girl had learning hands and a sharp mind for the healing arts, but she still believed that every problem had a solution, every wound could be mended. "There has to be another way," Mira had insisted, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "Someone else could." "Could what?" Elira had asked gently. "Old Henrik is already dying of the lung rot. Sarah's baby needs his mother. Young David has his whole life ahead of him. Who else, child? Who else carries so little weight in the balance of things?" The truth was simpler than sacrifice or nobility. Elira was tired in a way that sleep could not remedy. The absence of Thomas created a hollow space inside her chest that no amount of useful work could fill. Some mornings, she woke disappointed to find herself still breathing. The blood moon offering felt less like death and more like rest. Now, standing in the ancient clearing where generations of tributes had met their fate, Elira felt the strange piece of decision made. The rope binding her wrists was rough, but not cruel. The villagers who had escorted her here, Matthias, his son David, and 2 other men she had helped birth decades ago, had been gentle in their duty. They stood at the edge of the clearing now, their faces masks of sorrow and respect. The clearing itself was older than memory, a perfect circle of grass, surrounded by standing stones carved with symbols that predated written language. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting everything in silver relief. The blood moon hung heavy and red in the sky, its unusual color speaking to forces beyond normal understanding. According to legend, this was when the veil between worlds grew thin, when ancient powers stirred from their slumber to claim what was owed. Elira had expected to feel fear as the appointed hour approached. Instead, she found herself thinking of Thomas, not of his final illness, but of their early years together. How he would surprise her with wildflowers picked from dangerous meadows. The way he would hum old ballads while mending their roof, his patient hands teaching her to braid herbs for drying, the warmth of his body beside hers on cold nights, steady as a heartbeat. Perhaps death would be like falling asleep next to someone you loved. Perhaps the vampire lords, if they truly existed, would be swift in their mercy. Perhaps she would simply close her eyes and wake up somewhere else, somewhere Thomas waited with that crooked smile that had stolen her heart when she was barely 20. The night air carried scents of pine and earth, tinged with something wilder, a musk that seemed to come from the deep forest itself. Small sounds echoed from the darkness beyond the stones. The crack of twigs, the rustle of leaves, movements too deliberate to be wind. The men at the clearing's edge shifted nervously, their hands moving instinctively to the iron crosses that hung around their necks. "They're coming," whispered David, his voice barely audible. "God preserve us. They're actually coming." Elira turned toward the sound, surprised by a flutter of curiosity amid her resignation. In all her years of village life, the vampire lords had remained legend and shadow. If she was to die, tonight, at least she would finally see what had haunted her people's dreams for generations. The mist began to gather at the tree line, flowing like water across the forest floor. It moved against the natural wind, twisting upward in spirals that caught the blood moon's light and scattered it like fragments of stained glass. Within that mist, shapes moved, tall shadows that seemed to glide rather than walk. Elder Matthias began to recite the ritual words, his voice shaking with age and fear. "We offer what is precious to spare what is precious. We give one life to preserve many. Accept our tribute and honor the ancient compact." As the shadows drew closer, Elira found herself studying their movement with the clinical eye that had served her through decades of healing. These were not the shambling figures of children's nightmares, but beings of grace and purpose. Their forms suggested immense age and patience, the kind of stillness that comes only from having witnessed centuries pass like seasons. One shadow separated from the rest, taller and more substantial than the others. As it emerged from the mist, Elira caught her first clear glimpse of a vampire lord. He was magnificent and terrible, pale as moonlight, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His clothes spoke of quality and age, a long coat that might have been fashionable centuries ago, boots that had walked through more history than any mortal could imagine. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were ancient beyond measure. Yet when they found hers across the clearing, she saw something unexpected flicker in their depths. Not hunger, not cruelty, but something that looked almost like recognition. The vampire lord. For surely this was one of the legendary creatures stepped into the circle of standing stones. The very air seemed to thicken around him, charged with power that made Elira's skin prickle. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries, yet it held an odd gentleness. "What is this?" he asked, his gaze never leaving Elira's face. "What manner of offering do you bring me?" Elder Matthias stammered through his response. "My lord, we offer tribute as our fathers did, and their fathers before them, one life freely given to honor the compact between our peoples." The vampire's expression darkened. Freely given? His attention shifted to the rope binding Elira's wrists, then back to her face. "Woman, do you offer yourself freely to death?" The question hung in the air like incense. Elira met his ancient gaze without flinching, drawing on the same strength that had carried her through Thomas's final illness. "I do, my lord. My life has run its course. I am ready for whatever comes." Something changed in the vampire's face, a softening that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. He moved closer, studying her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. When he reached out to touch her cheek with one pale finger, Elira felt a jolt of something she couldn't name. "You look like you're mine now," he said softly, his words carrying a weight that went beyond their surface meaning. Not for death, but for something else entirely. The clearing fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant sound of Matthias's sharp intake of breath. Elira stared into the vampire's eyes, seeing depths that spoke of sorrow and longing that matched her own. In that moment, something stirred inside her that she had thought buried with her husband, not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. Whatever she had expected from this night, it was not this strange sense of recognition, this feeling that she was looking into the eyes of someone she had been waiting for without knowing it. The blood moon continued its silent passage overhead, but the nature of its witness had changed completely. The vampire lord's words hung in the blood-tinged air like a pata, spell waiting to be broken. Elder Matthias stumbled backward, his weathered face pale as parchment in the moonlight. The other villagers pressed closer together, their breathing shallow and quick, as if the very oxygen had become precious and scarce. "My lord," Matthias stammered, his voice cracking with age and terror. "We don't understand. The compact has always been honored with death. We offer tribute as our ancestors." "Your ancestors were fools," the vampire said, without taking his eyes from Elira's face. "And you compound their foolishness by repeating rituals you no longer comprehend." His pale hand remained against Elira's cheek, cool as marble, yet somehow comforting. "This woman does not belong to death. She belongs to me." Elira felt the world tilt beneath her feet. In all her preparations for this night, through all her quiet acceptance of ending, she had never imagined this possibility. The vampire's touch awakened something deep within her consciousness, not memory, exactly, but a sense of familiarity that defied explanation. She had the strangest feeling that this moment was not a beginning, but a return. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice steadier than she felt. "I came here to die. I made peace with that choice. The vampire's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it carried more sadness than joy. Peace with death is a luxury of the living, dear one. The dead rarely find it so simple. His thumb traced along her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. Tell me your name. Elira. Elira Morwen. At the sound of her name, something flickered in the vampire's ancient eyes, a flash of pain so profound it made Elira's heart ache in sympathy. His hand trembled against her face before he steadied it with visible effort. Elira, he repeated, as if testing the weight of each syllable. A name that suits you better than the one I once knew. He reached into his coat and withdrew an object that gleamed silver in the tent. Moonlight, a signet ring bearing symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the blood moon's glow. Do you know what this is? Elira studied the ring, fighting against a strange dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. The symbols meant nothing to her conscious mind, yet something deeper responded to their presence. Ancient powers, older than the village stones, older than human memory. A seal of some kind. Vampiric nobility? More than that. The vampire, she realized she still didn't know his name, slipped the ring onto his finger with ceremonial precision. This is the mark of the Thornwood Covenant, a binding that reaches back 7 centuries. It bears witness to oaths sworn in blood and magic, promises that transcend death itself. Elder Matthias found his voice again, though it shook like autumn leaves. My lord, please. If we have given offense, tell us how to make amends. The woman came here willingly, as the ancient ways demand. The vampire's attention shifted to the village elder, and Elira felt the temperature drop several degrees. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The ancient ways you speak of are corrupted echoes of a greater truth. Your people have practiced a ritual of sacrifice for generations, never knowing it was meant to summon me not to feed my hunger, but to guide me home to what I lost. Home. Elira found herself asking, what did you lose? The vampire's gaze returned to her, and she saw centuries of loneliness reflected in those dark depths. Everything that mattered. Everyone who made existence bearable. His hand moved from her cheek to the rope binding her wrists, and with a gesture that seemed almost casual, the blessed hemp fell away like morning mist. You ask what I lost? I lost you, Seraphina. I lost you, and I have been searching for you across lifetimes. The name hit Elira like a physical blow. Seraphina. She had never heard it before, yet it resonated in her bones like a half-remembered song. Images flashed through her mind, a great castle wreathed in mist, a woman in medieval dress standing at tall windows, pale hands reaching for her across an impossible distance. The visions came and went so quickly she might have imagined them, but their emotional weight left her breathless. That's not my name, she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Not in this life, the vampire agreed. But names are just labels we wear, like clothes that can be changed with the seasons. The soul beneath remains constant. He extended his hand toward her, palm up in invitation rather than demand. Come with me, Elira, who was Seraphina. Come and remember what we once meant to each other. David, Matthias's son, stepped forward with the brave foolishness of youth. You can't take her. She's under our protection and the compact. The vampire's head turned toward the young man with predatory grace. Boy, you speak of compacts you don't understand, to one who helped forge them. I could end your life with less effort than it takes you to draw breath. Do not test my patience. But Elira found her voice, surprising herself with its strength. Don't threaten them. If you truly know me, you know I would never willingly cause harm to innocents. The vampire's expression softened immediately, the dangerous edge fading from his features. You're right, of course. Your compassion was always your defining virtue. He bowed slightly to the villagers, a gesture that seemed to come from long habit rather than mockery. Forgive my harshness. Old fears die hard, and I have grown protective of what little hope I possess." Elira looked around the clearing at Matthias's frightened but determined face, at young David's confused bravery, at the other villagers who had known her for decades. These people were her responsibility, her life's work made flesh. Whatever strange connection she felt to this mysterious vampire, she couldn't simply abandon those who depended on her. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is too much to accept all at once. You speak of past lives and ancient oaths, but I am Elira the healer, Thomas Morwen's widow. That is the only life I know." The vampire studied her with those ancient eyes, and she sensed him weighing her words against some internal measure. When he nodded, it was with the patience of someone who had learned to think in centuries rather than moments. "Time you shall have," he said, "but not here, not surrounded by fears and superstitions that will cloud your judgment." He gestured toward the dark forest, and mist began to gather at his feet. "I offer you the sanctuary of my home, a place where memory flows more freely and truth reveals itself without the constraints of mortal expectations." "Your home?" Elira felt her pulse quicken. "You mean your castle, your domain?" "I mean the place where we were happy once, before death parted us and time scattered our bonds, like leaves in a storm." The vampire's voice carried a longing so profound it made Elira's heart ache. "I mean the chambers where you once laughed, the gardens where you once walked, the rooms that have waited empty for your return." Elder Matthias made a sound of protest. "Elira, think carefully. Whatever spell this creature weaves, whatever lies he tells, remember your duty to the living." But even as Matthias spoke, Elira felt the pull of something beyond duty or rational thought. The vampire's presence awakened echoes in her soul she couldn't explain, memories that weren't quite memories, dreams that felt more real than waking life. When she looked into his eyes, she saw not the monster of village legends, but a man, or what had once been a man, carrying a burden of loss that matched her own. "What is your name?" she asked suddenly. "If you know mine, I should know yours." The vampire smiled then, the first expression of genuine warmth she had seen from him. "I am Theran, Lord of the Thornwood, keeper of the ancient covenants, and guardian of memories too precious to forget." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried perfectly in the still air. "But to you, I was simply Theran, who loved Seraphina more than his own immortal existence." The name resonated through her like a bell struck in a cathedral. Theran, yes, that felt right in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Standing there in the ancient clearing with the blood moon casting everything in shades of crimson and silver, Elira felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. Perhaps some stories did not end with death. Perhaps some loves were strong enough to reach across centuries and call their other half home. The journey through the Thornwood forest defied everything Elira thought she knew about vampiric travel. Instead of supernatural speed or bat-like transformation, Theran simply walked beside her through paths that seemed to appear and vanish, at his will. The mist that had gathered in the clearing followed them like a living thing, parting branches and smoothing rough ground beneath their feet. "Are you cold?" Theran asked, as they moved deeper into the ancient woods. His voice carried genuine concern, as if her comfort mattered more than whatever urgent purpose drove him. Elira pulled her woolen shawl closer around her shoulders. The night air held autumn's bite, but something else as well, an otherworldly chill that seemed to seep from the trees themselves. "A little. But I've walked in worse weather." Without a word, Theran shrugged out of his long coat and draped it around her shoulders. The garment was far too large for her, but it held warmth that felt almost alive, as if it remembered the body that had worn it. The fabric was exquisite midnight blue wool, so fine it might have been spun from shadows, lined with silk that whispered against her skin. "This coat is centuries old," she observed, running her fingers along the intricate embroidery at the cuffs. 437 years, to be precise," Theran replied. It was a gift from someone who understood the value of quality craftsmanship. Something in his tone suggested the gift had come from someone important, someone whose memory he treasured. As they walked, Elira found herself studying her companion with the analytical eye she'd developed through decades of healing. Theran moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was nothing threatening in his demeanor toward her. If anything, he seemed to be restraining himself, keeping his natural power carefully leashed. His pale hands, when they occasionally brushed against branches or stones, left no mark of their passing. "How long have you been searching for me?" she asked. "You spoke of lifetimes, how many?" Theran was quiet for so long that Elira thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated sorrow. "This is the 7th incarnation I have found. Each time, death claimed you before I could restore what we had lost. Each time, I have been forced to begin the search anew." The revelation struck Elira like a physical blow. 7 times she had been born, lived, and died, while this immortal being searched for traces of someone she had once been. "The others, my previous selves, did you reach them in time? Twice I found you as a child, too young to understand or remember. Those lives I watched from a distance, ensuring your safety until age and wisdom could prepare you for truth." Theran's expression darkened. 3 times I found you already bound to mortal love, with families and lives I could not bear to destroy. I let you live in peace, treasuring what glimpses I could steal. And the other 2? Gone before I could reach them. War took one, plague the other. I have learned that time is the cruelest enemy of all, even crueler than death, because it offers hope while delivering only loss. Elira absorbed this information, feeling the staggering weight of his patience. 4 centuries of searching, of hope renewed and shattered, of love that refused to accept the finality of death. "Why?" she whispered. "Why continue such torment? Surely at some point the pain would outweigh the hope." Theran stopped walking, turning to face her in the misty half-light. His ancient eyes held depths of emotion that made her heart ache in sympathy. "Have you ever loved someone so completely that their absence made breathing an effort? Someone whose laugh was the only music that mattered, whose touch was the only warmth worth having?" The questions hit too close to home. Thomas's face rose unbidden in her memory, his gentle smile, his patient hands, the way he hummed old ballads while working. "Yes," she said softly, "I have." "Then you understand why I cannot stop searching, why I would endure 1,000 centuries of emptiness for one more moment of completeness." Theran reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't, his fingers brushed against her temple. "Some bonds transcend flesh, transcend time itself. What we shared was such a bond." At his touch, images flashed through Elira's mind, like lightning illuminating a darkened landscape, a great castle rising from mist-shrouded hills. Tall windows filled with candlelight, a woman's laughter echoing through stone corridors. The visions came too fast to grasp, leaving only impressions and a strange ache of familiarity. "I don't remember," she said, frustrated by the tantalizing fragments that slipped away even as she tried to hold them. "I feel something when you speak of the past, but it's like trying to recall a dream. Memory is like a garden that has been left untended," Theran said gently, his hand falling away from her face. "The seeds remain, but they need proper soil and care to bloom again." He gestured ahead, where the forest path curved around a massive oak, whose trunk was wider than a cottage. "Perhaps seeing familiar ground will help." As they rounded the great tree, Elira gasped. The forest opened into a vast clearing dominated by a castle that seemed to have grown from the very stones of the earth. It was not the crude fortress she might have expected, but a structure of grace and beauty, its towers reaching toward the stars like fingers in prayer. Warm light glowed from countless windows, promising comfort and sanctuary rather than the cold horror of legend. "This is your home," she breathed. "Our home," Theran corrected quietly. "Every stone was placed with your approval, every room designed for your comfort. You chose the placement of the gardens, selected the books for the library, arranged the furniture in chambers that have waited empty for your return." Elira stared at the magnificent structure, fighting against a growing sense of déjà vu. Something about the proportions, the way the towers caught moonlight, the graceful arch. Of the main entrance it all felt achingly familiar. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Beauty was always important to you," Theran said. "Not vanity or display, but true beauty, the kind that nurtures the soul and reminds the heart that wonder still exists in dark times." They approached the castle through gardens that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Elira paused beside a fountain carved from white marble, its water singing a gentle melody as it fell from tier to tier. Around its base grew flowers. She didn't recognize blooms that glowed like captured starlight, their fragrance carrying hints of seasons that had never quite existed. "These flowers," she began, "grow only in moonlight and memory," Theran finished. "They were your creation, born from magic and longing during our first spring together. Each bloom holds a moment of happiness too precious to let fade completely." As Elira bent to touch one of the luminous petals, a crystal pendant around Theran's neck began to glow with soft silver light. The stone was translucent as winter ice, but within its depths, colors swirled like captured aurora. The moment her fingers brushed the magical flower, the pendant's glow intensified, and more images flooded her mind. A woman's hands, her hands carefully planting seeds in rich earth. Laughter shared over morning tea in a sunlit breakfast room. Long evenings spent reading by firelight, while rain drummed against diamond-paned windows. The memories felt real as breathing, yet impossible as flight. "The pendant holds fragments of what we were," Theran explained, noticing her fascination with the glowing crystal. "Memory made manifest, love given form. When you begin to truly remember, it will sing with recognition." The interior of Theran's castle defied every expectation Elira had formed about vampiric dwellings. Instead of cold stone and gothic horror, she found herself in rooms that breathed with warmth and life, tapestries in rich jewel. Tones softened the walls, while thick carpets from distant lands cushioned her footsteps. Candles burned in silver sconces, their light dancing across furniture that spoke of centuries of careful craftsmanship. Theran led her through corridors lined with portraits of people from various eras, their clothing marking the passage of time like a visual history lesson. Some faces seemed familiar, though Elira couldn't place where she might have seen them. One painting in particular caught her attention, a woman in medieval dress standing beside a tall window, her dark hair adorned with pearls, her expression serene yet touched with sadness. "She looks like me," Elira whispered, stopping before the portrait. "She was you," Theran said simply. "Lady Seraphina de Montclair, born in the year of our Lord 1387, died in 1425. His voice carried reverence and pain in equal measure. "That portrait was painted during our third year together, just before—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. "Before what?" "Before the world reminded us that happiness is always temporary." Theran turned away from the painting, but not before Elira glimpsed the raw grief that crossed his features. "Come, there is something you need to see." He guided her to a chamber at the castle's heart, a circular room with walls lined, floor to ceiling with books. A fire crackled in an ornate fireplace, casting dancing shadows across leather-bound volumes and illuminated manuscripts. But it wasn't the library that made Elira's breath catch in her throat. It was the small writing desk positioned near the windows and the yellowed parchments scattered across its surface. "Letters," Theran said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Written in your hand, in Seraphina's hand. I found them hidden in the walls after she died." They were meant for me, but I never received them in time. With trembling fingers, Elira approached the desk. The parchments were fragile with age, their edges brown and brittle, but the ink remained dark and clear. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, flowing and elegant in the style of educated medieval women. As she leaned closer to read, her heart began to race. "My dearest Theran," the first letter began, "I write this knowing we may never again walk together in the moonlight gardens you created for my joy. The sickness that claims our village spreads like wildfire, and I fear my mortal flesh cannot withstand what approaches. But know this, in whatever realm awaits beyond death's door, I will search for you as faithfully as you have searched for me." Elira's hands shook as she reached for the next letter. The words seemed to burn themselves into her memory as she read, "Each night I dream of eternity at your side, of love that transcends the boundaries flesh imposes upon the spirit. If there is magic enough to grant such wishes, if there are powers that honor bonds forged in perfect understanding, then surely we shall find each other again. Look for me in springtime, beloved. Look for me in the laughter of children and the whisper of wind through new leaves." "I don't understand," Elira said, though even as she spoke the words, part of her did understand, a part buried so deep it felt like racial memory. "These letters, this handwriting, it's mine, but I've never written such things. I've never known such love exists." Theran moved to stand beside her, careful not to crowd her personal space. "Have you not? What of the man you mentioned in the clearing, your husband Thomas?" The question struck home with unexpected force. Elira closed her eyes, summoning memories of her life with Thomas. Their love had been real, deep and sustaining, but it had been the love of two people who found comfort in companionship, who built a life together through mutual respect and affection. Reading these letters felt like discovering a different language entirely. A love that consumed and transformed, that reached beyond the physical world into realms of spirit and eternity. "Thomas and I loved each other deeply," she said slowly. "But this," she gestured to the letters, "this is something else entirely. This is love as a force of nature, love as magic itself." "Yes," Theran said simply, "it was magic. You were magic. Your very presence in my existence transformed what had been merely survival into something approaching transcendence." He picked up another letter, his ancient eyes scanning words he had clearly read countless times. "This one was written the night before you fell ill. Listen. I have been thinking about time, my darling, and how strange it is that we measure our lives in years when what matters happens in moments. The moment you first spoke my name, the moment you showed me the gardens, the moment I understood that some souls are crafted to be two halves of one whole. If I have only moments left, let them be filled with the certainty that our love has changed the very fabric of existence." As Theran read, Elira felt something shifting inside her consciousness. Not quite memory, but a sense of recognition that went deeper than thought. The voice in those letters felt familiar, like an echo of something she had once been but somehow forgotten. The emotions described resonated in her bones, awakening longings she had never acknowledged even to herself. "How did she die?" Elira asked. "How did I die?" Theran's face grew grave. "Plague. The same disease that had ravaged the countryside reached our sanctuary, despite all my power to protect you. You sickened quickly, as mortals do. I tried everything, magic, alchemy, bargains with forces that should never be invoked. Nothing could hold death at bay." "And you?" Elira turned to face him fully, seeing the weight of centuries in his expression. "How did you survive such loss?" "I didn't survive," Theran said with stark honesty. "I simply continued to exist. For 400 years I have been a ghost, haunting my own life, waiting for the universe to restore what it stole from me." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Until tonight. Until you." Elira felt tears gathering in her eyes, not just for Serafina's tragic fate, but for this immortal being who had carried such devastating loss for so long. The letters had awakened something in her, a recognition that transcended rational understanding. Whether through reincarnation, magic, or simple impossible coincidence, she was connected to this story in ways that defied explanation. "I'm not her," she said finally. "I'm not Serafina. I'm Elira, a village healer who loved a mortal man and lived a simple life. I can't be what you've been searching for." Theran studied her face with those ancient, patient eyes. "Perhaps not yet," he said gently. "But souls recognize each other across any distance, through any disguise. What I feel when I look at you, what you felt when you heard my name, that recognition comes from something deeper than memory. It comes from the place where love writes itself into the fundamental laws of existence." The memory crystal around his neck pulsed with soft light, responding to some emotion too deep for words. In that glow, Elira saw not just the vampire lord who had claimed her from death, but a man who had loved so completely that he'd made eternity itself a prison of hope. Theran led Elira to a chamber she hadn't seen before, a room where moonlight streamed through tall windows to illuminate what appeared to be an ancient mirror. But as they drew closer, Elira realized this was no ordinary looking glass. The surface seemed to ripple like water, and within its depths, images moved and shifted like dreams made visible. "The Moonstone Mirror," Theran said, his voice heavy with significance. "It shows truth that eyes alone cannot perceive, the soul beneath the flesh, the memories that sleep in the deepest chambers of the heart." Elira stared at the mystical artifact, feeling both drawn to and terrified of what it might reveal. "What will it show me?" "Whatever you need to see," Theran replied. "But be warned, truth is often more difficult to bear than ignorance. Once you look into that mirror and see yourself as you truly are, there can be no returning to the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the nature of existence." Taking a deep breath that felt like a prayer, Elira stepped before the mirror. For a moment, she saw only her own reflection, a woman of 58 years, marked by time and loss, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined with the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of a life fully lived. Then the surface began to ripple, and her reflection changed. The face looking back at her was younger, smoother, framed by hair that fell in dark waves to her shoulders. But it was unmistakably the same face, the same eyes, the same soul looking out from features touched by medieval sunlight instead of frontier hardship. "Lady Serafina Day." Montclair gazed back at her with expressions that cycled through love, joy, sorrow, and acceptance. A lifetime of emotions playing across features that were foreign yet familiar. "Dear God," Elira whispered, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. But the mirror wasn't finished. The image shifted again, showing other faces, 6 others, each clearly the same soul wearing different flesh, a Celtic maiden with intricate tattoos adorning her arms, a Renaissance merchant's daughter with intelligent eyes and ink-stained fingers, a frontier woman whose calloused hands spoke of hard labor and harder choices. Each face was different, yet each carried the unmistakable essence that made them fundamentally the same person. 7 lives, Theran said softly from behind her. 7 chances for our souls to find each other again. The emotional impact hit Elira like a physical blow. She was staring at the evidence of her own reincarnation, watching the story of a love that had transcended death not once, but multiple times. The rational part of her mind reeled against such impossibility, but her heart recognized the truth in ways that logic could never touch. "I remember," she gasped, pressing her hands against the mirror's surface. "Not everything, but fragments. Standing in castle gardens with someone I loved more than breath itself. Lying sick while rain drummed against windows, knowing I was leaving him behind. The ache of searching for something I'd lost without knowing what it was. The memories came in waves now, no longer filtered through the comfortable distance of dreams. She remembered Theran as he had been in life, not the immortal vampire lord, but a mortal man with kind eyes and gentle hands, whose laughter could chase away the darkest moods. She remembered their courtship, how he had pursued her with old-world courtesy and modern passion, never demanding more than she was willing to give. Most painful of all, she remembered dying, the fever that claimed her strength day by day, the growing awareness that her time was ending, the desperate desire to live just long enough to see one more spring with the man who had become her whole world. "You were mortal then," she said, turning to face Theran with tears streaming down her face. "In that first life you were human like me." Theran's ancient features cracked with emotion. "I was a minor lord with lands on the Scottish border, content with my small domain and simple life, until the day you arrived at my court seeking shelter from a storm. 3 years we had together before plague took you from me. 3 years that contained more happiness than most souls experience in a dozen lifetimes. How did you become?" She gestured at his obviously supernatural nature. "Desperation," Theran said simply. "After you died, I sought out every legend, every dark tale, every whisper of power that might allow me to bring you back or join you in death. I found something older and hungrier than human understanding, a force that offered immortality in exchange for service. I accepted, thinking I would use eternal life to find a way to resurrect you. But it didn't work that way. No. The magic that transformed me into what I am now came with prices I hadn't anticipated. I could not die to join you, nor could I use my newfound power to restore life to the dead. All I could do was wait and search, following the traces of your soul as it found new bodies, new lives, new chances at mortal happiness." Elira sank into a chair, positioned near the mirror, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she was learning. The comfortable certainties of her existence, her identity as Thomas Morwyn's widow, her life as a simple village healer, had been shattered by revelations that rewrote everything she thought she knew about herself. "The other lives," she said finally. "You found me in some of them. What happened?" Theran moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens where phantom flowers bloomed in eternal spring. "Twice, as I mentioned, I found you too young to understand the truth. I became a distant protector, ensuring your safety while you lived innocent lives. When you died of natural causes in old age, I mourned and began the search again. And the others? 3 times you were already bound to mortal loves when I found you. Good men who cherished you as you deserved to be cherished. I could not bring myself to destroy such happiness for my own selfish need." His voice grew heavy with old pain. "I watched from shadows as you built lives with others, content to glimpse your smile from a distance rather than cause you suffering by revealing truths that would only bring confusion and heartbreak. That must have been agony for you. Love sometimes requires sacrifice," Theran said simply. "Your happiness mattered more than my pain. It always has." The weight of his devotion, the depth of sacrifice he had made for her, sake across centuries, left Elira breathless. She thought of her own marriage to Thomas, how grief at his loss had nearly broken her spirit. To lose someone, and then be forced to watch them love another multiple times, across lifetimes, the emotional torture was beyond imagination. "And this time?" she asked. "What makes this incarnation different?" Theran turned from the window, and she saw hope flickering in his ancient eyes. "This time, you came to me freely. Not as a child or as another man's wife, but as a woman who had known love and loss, who understood the weight of choice. This time, perhaps, we have a chance to finish what death interrupted so long ago." 3 days passed in Theran's castle, like a dream suspended between reality and impossibility. Elira found herself settling into rhythms that felt both foreign and familiar. Breakfasting in a sunlit chamber that faced east toward distant mountains, walking garden paths where flowers bloomed in defiance of autumn's chill, spending long hours in the library where Theran would read to her from books written in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as they sat before the fireplace in comfortable silence, that Theran presented her with something that made her heart stop. The object rested in a small velvet box, its surface gleaming like captured blood in the firelight. A brooch in the shape of a rose, its petals crafted from what appeared to be crystallized crimson. "I've been waiting for the right moment to show you this," Theran said, his voice unusually hesitant. "It was yours in that first life, a betrothal gift I commissioned for you during our second year together." Elira lifted the brooch from its resting place, gasping as it began to glow with warm light the moment her fingers touched its surface. The crystal rose seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, its color deepening from crimson to rich burgundy and back again, more. Startling still, she could swear she smelled the fragrance of real roses, sweet and intoxicating, filling the air around them. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But why is it glowing?" The blood rose brooch was crafted by masters who understood that true love possesses its own magic, Theran explained, moving closer on the small sofa they shared. "The crystal will only bloom, only show its true beauty when worn by someone whose heart recognizes its destined match." As if drawn by forces beyond her control, Elira pinned the brooch to her dress. The moment the clasp closed, the rose burst into full radiance, its light warm and welcoming as summer sunshine. The fragrance intensified, and she felt something shift in the very air between them, a recognition that went deeper than memory, more fundamental than thought. "Theran," she said softly, turning to face him. In the rose's glow, his ancient features seemed softer, more human. She could see in his face not just the immortal vampire lord, but echoes of the mortal man who had loved Seraphina with such devotion that he'd traded his humanity for the chance to find her again. "Yes?" His voice was barely a whisper, hope and fear warring in his dark eyes. Instead of answering with words, Elira reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone, the curve of his jaw. His skin was cool but not cold, marble smooth, yet somehow alive with hidden warmth. When she leaned forward, closing the distance between them, he met her halfway with the desperate care of someone who had dreamed of this moment for centuries. Their first kiss was gentle as falling snow, tentative as two souls testing the waters of possibility. But as the blood rose brooch blazed with increasingly brilliant light, the kiss deepened into something that transcended the physical world entirely. Elira felt memories flooding back, not just images, but sensations and emotions that belonged to Seraphina yet were, undeniably, her own. She remembered other kisses shared in moonlit gardens, the feeling of absolute safety that came from being held by someone who understood her soul completely. She remembered laughter shared over morning tea, quiet conversations that lasted until dawn, the profound peace of sleeping beside someone whose heartbeat matched the rhythm of her own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together in intimate connection. The brooch had settled into a steady, warm glow that bathed them both in rose-colored light. "I remember loving you," Elira said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just the idea of you, not just because these artifacts and mirrors tell me I remember the feeling itself, the way you made me laugh when grief threatened to overwhelm me, the patience with which you taught me to appreciate poetry, the way you would bring me wildflowers for no reason other than that their beauty reminded you of my smile." Theran's eyes closed as if her words caused him physical pain. "And I remember every moment of loving you, every expression that crossed your face, every song you hummed while working in the garden, every way you had of making ordinary days feel like miracles simply by sharing them with me." They sat in comfortable intimacy, the brooch's light creating a cocoon of warmth around them. But even as Elira reveled in the return of memories and feelings she thought lost forever, practical concerns intruded on her consciousness. "My village," she said finally. They must think I'm dead. My apprentice Mira, she'll be trying to handle everything alone. The autumn sickness season is beginning, and she's not ready for such responsibility. Theran's expression grew troubled. I have been monitoring the village through my connections with the forest itself. They did assume you were dead initially, but young Mira has refused to accept your loss. She's been asking questions, organizing search parties. A chill of foreboding ran down Elira's spine. Search parties? Theran, if they come into the deep woods looking for me, they will encounter dangers they're not equipped to handle, he finished grimly. The Thornwood is home to more than just my kind. Ancient things dwell in these shadows, creatures that view human intrusion as invitation to hunt. You have to stop them. I have been trying, through indirect means, mists that obscure trails, sounds that discourage deeper exploration. But mortal determination can overcome even supernatural discouragement when love drives it. Elira felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These people had been her charge for decades. She had delivered their children, healed their wounds, guided them through countless crises. The thought of them coming to harm because of her disappearance was unbearable. There's something else, Theran said reluctantly. My court, the other vampire lords who acknowledge my authority, they are not pleased with recent developments. Some view my claim on you as weakness, a dangerous indulgence that threatens our kind's survival. Why? Because loving a mortal, even a reincarnated one, reminds them of their own lost humanity. It threatens the emotional distance they maintain to survive immortality's burdens. Theran's jaw tightened. Lord Cassius, in particular, has made it clear that he views you as a threat to be eliminated. The revelation that vampire politics might endanger not just her, but her village sent ice through Elira's veins. She thought of Mira's earnest face, of all the people who depended on her healing skills, of the children she'd helped bring into the world who might suffer because of choices she didn't fully understand. What do we do? She asked. Theran's hand covered hers, his touch steady and reassuring despite the gravity of their situation. We find a way to protect what matters to both of us. Your people, our love, the fragile hope that perhaps this time, finally, we can have the ending that was stolen from us 4 centuries ago. The discovery came by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. Elira had been exploring the castle's lower levels, drawn by curiosity about chambers Theran hadn't shown her. In a vault beneath the great hall, she found rows of ancient documents preserved in glass, cases, contracts, treaties, and scrolls bearing seals from long-dead kingdoms. But it was one particular parchment, its surface covered in elaborate calligraphy and mystical symbols, that made her blood run cold. The Covenant Scroll. Her hands trembled as she lifted the glass case, revealing text written in languages both familiar and foreign. Somehow, impossibly, she could read every word. The knowledge flowed into her consciousness like water into a dry riverbed, awakening understanding that belonged to Seraphina's memories. "What have you found?" Theran's voice behind her carried. Notes of concern and resignation, as if he had been dreading this moment for centuries. Elira turned to face him, the scroll clutched in her hands. "This document, it's about me. About us, about what really happened 400 years ago." Her voice rose with each word, anger and betrayal warring with disbelief. "You didn't tell me the truth." Theran's ancient features cracked with pain. "Which truth would you have preferred? There are so many layers to this story, each one more devastating than the last." "The truth that my death wasn't from plague," Elira said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "The truth that I chose to die, that I sacrificed myself deliberately to save my people from vampire destruction." The words hung in the air between them like accusations. Theran closed his eyes, his shoulders bowing under the weight of secrets finally exposed. "Yes," he whispered, "you chose death over life with me. You chose duty over love. The scroll's ancient text blazed in Elira's mind, revealing the full scope of what Seraphina had done. 400 years ago, when plague ravaged the countryside and vampire lords preyed on weakened human settlements, the mortal kingdoms had been losing a war they couldn't win. Traditional weapons were useless against immortal foes, and humanity faced extinction. But there had been another way. Ancient magic, older than vampires themselves, offered a solution that required the ultimate price. A willing sacrifice, made by someone pure of heart and strong of will, could create a mystical barrier that would protect human settlements from supernatural predation. The magic would transform the sacrifice's life force into a protective ward that could span generations. "I was dying anyway," Elira said, reading from the scroll's illuminated text. "The plague had already claimed me, but instead of dying uselessly, I chose to make my death meaningful. You chose to leave me behind, to live with the knowledge that you valued. Strangers' lives more than our love," Theran said, his voice raw with 4 centuries of accumulated hurt. "You chose to become a martyr rather than fight for the happiness we had found together." The accusation stung because it carried truth. Elira could feel Seraphina's memories of that final choice. The agony of knowing that her death would devastate the man she loved beyond measure, balanced against the certainty that thousands of innocent lives hung in the balance. It had been the hardest decision any soul could make. "The barrier," Elira continued reading, her voice growing steadier as understanding bloomed. "It wasn't meant to last forever. The scroll says it requires renewal every 4 centuries, on the anniversary of the original sacrifice." Theran nodded grimly. "Which approaches rapidly. The blood moon gathering your village practices isn't just tradition, it's an echo of the original ritual, kept alive by racial memory, even though the participants no longer understand its true purpose. And if the barrier fails, humanity becomes prey again. The protection that has kept vampire lords from open predation for 4 centuries vanishes, and the supernatural world reclaims its dominance over the mortal one." Theran's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Villages like yours would be wiped out within months." Elira sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. The comfortable narrative of star-crossed lovers reunited by fate had shattered, revealing something far more complex and morally fraught. Her current situation wasn't just about personal choice, it was about the survival of her entire species. "The renewal ritual," she said, forcing herself to continue reading despite growing dread. "What does it require?" Theran was quiet for so long that Elira thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words confirmed her worst fears. "The same price as the original, a willing sacrifice, made by the same soul that created the barrier initially. Me, yes. And if I refuse, the barrier fails completely. Humanity becomes vulnerable to predation, not just from my kind, but from all the supernatural forces that have been held at bay for centuries. Your village, your apprentice, every mortal settlement within 1,000 miles, all become hunting grounds for creatures that view human life as livestock." The emotional impact hit Elira like a physical blow. She had found love beyond imagination, memories of happiness that transcended mortal understanding, and the possibility of eternal life with someone who cherished her soul completely. But accepting that gift would damn countless innocents to death, and worse. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Some alternative that doesn't require—" "I have searched for 4 centuries," Theran interrupted gently. "I have consulted every sage, every mystic, every repository of ancient knowledge that exists in our world. The magic that created the barrier is absolute in its requirements. It can only be renewed by the same soul that forged it originally. But what if I choose transformation instead of death?" The idea came to her suddenly, born of desperation and hope. The scroll mentions vampiric immortality, What if I accept your gift and become what you are? Would that satisfy the ritual's requirements? Theran's expression shifted, hope and fear warring in his ancient eyes. It might. The magic requires a willing sacrifice, but it doesn't explicitly demand death, only the surrender of mortal existence. If you chose transformation, became immortal like me, it could theoretically fulfill the Covenant's terms while allowing us to be together. Theoretically, the ritual has never been attempted with transformation as the sacrifice. We would be pioneering magical territory with the survival of humanity hanging in the balance. Theran moved closer, his voice urgent, and there are prices to vampiric immortality that you must understand. You would gain eternal life, but lose the ability to bear children, to age naturally, to experience the simple joys of mortal existence. You would become a predator, dependent on blood for survival, forever changed from what you are now. Elira absorbed this information, weighing eternal love against human survival, personal happiness against species-wide responsibility. The choice before her was staggering in its implications, not just for herself and Theran, but for every mortal soul whose protection depended on her decision. "How long do we have?" she asked. "The blood-moon cycle completes in 7 days. The barrier's power wanes with each passing hour, and supernatural creatures grow bolder in their encroachment on human territory." Theran's voice carried urgency that spoke of centuries of careful monitoring. "Already, reports reach me of attacks on outlying settlements, of creatures venturing closer to protected areas than they have in generations. And my village remains safe for now, but that safety is precarious. Young Mira's search parties venture deeper into dangerous territory each day, and Lord Cassius grows more insistent that I abandon what he sees as foolish sentiment for the greater good of our kind." The revelation that she faced, not just personal choice, but a deadline that could mean the difference between human survival and extinction, left Elira reeling. Everything she thought she understood about her situation had been built on incomplete information. The fairy tale of reincarnated love had revealed itself as something far more complex, a cosmic responsibility that had followed her soul across lifetimes. "Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" she asked. Theran's smile was sad and tender. "Because I hoped that perhaps this time, just once, love could triumph over duty. I hoped that we might find happiness without the weight of humanity's survival crushing our joy." He reached for her hands, his touch gentle despite the supernatural strength in his pale fingers. "I am selfish enough to want you for myself, Elira. Even knowing the cost, even understanding what's at stake, I cannot bear the thought of losing you again." The transformation chalice rested on a pedestal at the heart of Theran's most sacred chamber, its surface gleaming like captured starlight. Crafted from enchanted silver and obsidian, the goblet seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, as if it contained a heartbeat made of moonlight and shadow. Ancient runes spiraled around its base, their meaning lost to all but the most learned students of forgotten arts. "It was created by the first vampires," Theran explained, his voice reverent as he approached the artifact. "Those who chose immortality not for power or cruelty, but for love so profound they could not bear the thought of eternal separation. The chalice transforms without corrupting, preserves humanity while granting supernatural gifts." Elira circled the pedestal slowly, studying the goblet from every angle. Tomorrow night, when the blood moon reached its peak, she would need to make a choice that could determine humanity's fate. The weight of that decision pressed on her shoulders like a physical burden, but she forced herself to focus on practical considerations. "If I drink from this, what exactly happens?" "The transformation is gradual but irreversible," Theran said. "Your mortal body will be remade at the cellular level, granted the strength and immortality of vampire kind, while preserving the essential humanity that makes you who you are. You will retain your capacity for love, compassion, and moral choice. But you will also gain abilities that transcend mortal limitations. And you believe this will satisfy the Covenant's requirements? The ancient magic seeks a willing sacrifice of mortal existence in service to humanity's protection. Whether that sacrifice takes the form of death or transformation should not matter to the fundamental ritual structure. Theran paused, his expression growing grave. But I must be honest with you, beloved. We are venturing into uncharted territory. The consequences of failure would be catastrophic, Elira finished. I understand. Over the past 3 days, as they had prepared for the ritual, disturbing reports had reached the castle. A merchant caravan attacked by creatures that should have been unable to approach human settlements. Livestock found drained of blood in villages that had been safe for centuries. Most troubling of all, supernatural beings were being spotted closer and closer to populated areas as the barrier's power continued to wane. There's still time to reconsider, Theran said softly. If you choose the traditional path, true death in service to the Covenant, humanity's protection would be assured for another 4 centuries. Your sacrifice would be remembered and honored, and countless lives would be saved. Elira met his eyes, seeing the conflict raging there. After 4 centuries of searching for her, he was offering to support her decision, even if it meant losing her forever once again. The depth of his love, the completeness of his willingness to put her choice above his own desperate need, humbled her beyond words. "And you?" she asked. "What would become of you if I choose death over transformation?" "I would endure," Theran said simply, "as I have endured for 400 years. Perhaps this time I would not search for your next incarnation. Perhaps I would finally allow myself the rest of true death, knowing that our love had served a purpose greater than our personal happiness." The thought of driving him to such despair made Elira's heart ache. She had seen the toll that centuries of loss had taken on him, witnessed the way hope and grief warred constantly in his ancient eyes. To add another devastating loss to his burden seemed unbearably cruel. A soft chime echoed through the chamber, and a figure materialized from shadow near the doorway. Elira tensed, recognizing one of Theran's vampire courtiers, a pale, elegant creature whose presence radiated barely contained hostility. "Lord Cassius," Theran said, his voice carefully neutral. "You arrive unexpectedly. The situation has become untenable," Cassius replied, his cold gaze fixed on Elira. "While you indulge in romantic nostalgia, practical matters demand attention. The mortal woman's village has organized another search party, 30 armed men this time, led by that persistent apprentice healer. They enter the deep forest at dawn." Elira's blood ran cold. "Mira, I have to stop them. They don't understand what they're walking into." "Indeed they do not," Cassius agreed with cruel satisfaction. "The forest depths contain creatures that have been contained by the weakening barrier for months, hungry things that grow bolder as the ancient protections fail. Your human friends are walking into a slaughter." "Then we must warn them," Elira said, moving toward the chamber door. Cassius's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Warn them? Why would we endanger ourselves for mortals who intrude where they do not belong? Let natural selection take its course. Because innocent lives matter," Elira snapped, her healer's instincts overriding diplomatic caution. "Because those people are searching for me out of love and loyalty, not knowing the danger they face. Precisely the kind of sentimental thinking that weakens our kind," Cassius replied. "Theran, your obsession with this mortal has blinded you to reality. The barrier will fail, regardless of what she chooses, transformation or death. The ritual is too risky to attempt. Better to let humanity fend for itself while we consolidate power for the new age that approaches." Theran's response was swift and deadly serious. "Cassius, you overstep. The Covenant has protected our kind as much as theirs. Without it, we face not just human resistance but the return of other supernatural predators who view vampires as competition for mortal prey." A risk worth taking for the prize of unfettered hunting grounds. The casual cruelty in Cassius's voice made Elira sick. Here was the vampire of human nightmares, the predator who viewed mortal life as nothing more than sustenance. But she also sensed opportunity in his hostility. "You're afraid," she said suddenly, studying his face with the analytical skill that had served her through decades of healing. "You're terrified that the ritual might actually work, that transformation could satisfy the Covenant's requirements. Because that would mean losing your excuse for predation, wouldn't it?" Cassius's elegant features twisted with rage. I dare speak truth," Elira continued, her voice growing stronger. "If I succeed in renewing the barrier through transformation, vampire kind loses its justification for viewing humanity as prey. The Covenant's protection continues, but it also establishes precedent for cooperation rather than predation." "Enough," Theran said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of centuries. "Cassius, you will respect my guest and my decisions. The ritual will proceed as planned." "Will it?" Cassius's smile was cold and dangerous. "Even if the village search party provides an unfortunate distraction at precisely the wrong moment? Even if certain younger vampires, eager to prove their worth, decide that preventing the ritual serves the greater good of our kind?" The threat hung in the air like poisonous smoke. Elira realized with growing horror that they faced not just the challenge of an untested magical ritual, but active opposition from within Theran's own court. The timing couldn't be worse. With the blood moon peak approaching in mere hours, any disruption could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. "The search party," Elira said, urgently. "We have to reach them before they encounter whatever's hunting in the deep forest, and we have to complete the ritual before your enemies can interfere." Theran nodded grimly. "The timing will be precise to the point of impossibility. The blood moon reaches its peak at midnight. We have perhaps 6 hours to warn your villagers. Return to the castle and complete the transformation ritual without interruption. And if we're too late, if the ritual fails or gets disrupted, then the barrier collapses completely," Theran said. "Humanity loses its protection, supernatural predators reclaim their dominion over the mortal world, and everything Seraphina sacrificed for becomes meaningless." Elira felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on her shoulders. In the next few hours, she would need to save her friends from certain death, undergo a mystical transformation that had never been attempted, and somehow renew magical protections that had kept humanity safe for 4 centuries. The margin for error was non-existent. "There's something else," she said, a terrible thought occurring to her. "If Cassius is willing to sabotage the ritual, what's to stop him from attacking the village directly? If the barrier fails anyway, why not eliminate potential witnesses to what happened here?" Theran's face went pale as the implications hit him. He wouldn't dare. The exposure would risk everything our kind has built. Unless he plans to make it look like the search party was killed by wild animals or forest accidents. Unless he intends to use their deaths as proof that mortals cannot survive in supernatural territory. The sound of distant howls drifted through the castle's windows, not wolves, but something far more dangerous. Something that had been waiting for the barrier's protection to weaken enough to allow approach to human settlements. "It's beginning," Theran said, his voice tight with urgency. "The barrier's collapse accelerates as the blood moon rises. We're out of time for careful planning." Elira looked at the transformation chalice one more time, its silver surface reflecting her face like a mirror of destiny. In a few hours, she would either drink from that goblet and become something unprecedented, a vampire created not for power but for love and service, or she would die attempting to save everyone she cared about. "Then we go now," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We save who we can, and we finish what Seraphina started 400 years ago." The blood moon hung heavy in the darkening sky, its crimson light promising either salvation or catastrophe. There would be no second chances. The deep forest erupted into chaos as Elira and Theran raced through shadowed paths toward the sound of human screams. Above them, the blood moon cast everything in crimson light, its supernatural glow awakening ancient hungers that had been held at bay for centuries. Through the trees ahead, the orange flicker of torches revealed the desperate last stand of Mira's search party. 30 men from the village had entered the Thornwood at dawn, armed with iron weapons and blessed crosses, following trails that should have led them to safety or closure. Instead, they had stumbled into a feeding ground where creatures of nightmare had been gathering as the barrier's protection weakened. The sounds of battle steel clashing against claw, human voices raised in prayer and terror carried through the night air like a symphony of destruction. There, Theran pointed to a clearing where torchlight revealed the full horror of what they faced. Shadow creatures with too many teeth surrounded the surviving villagers, while overhead, winged things circled like vultures, waiting for the final collapse. At the center of the defensive circle, Elira could see Mira's distinctive red hair as the young healer tried to tend wounded men while fighting for her own life. "The soul-binding chain," Theran said, producing a length of silver links from his coat. The mystical artifact gleamed with its own internal light, each link inscribed with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the blood moon's glow. "If we're going to attempt the transformation ritual under these conditions, we'll need its power to ensure you retain your humanity during the change." Elira barely heard him, her attention fixed on the desperate battle ahead. "They're dying because of me, because they came looking for someone they thought needed rescue. They're dying because Cassius orchestrated this," Theran corrected grimly. "But we can still save who remains. The chain will allow me to bind our souls together during your transformation, ensuring that love, not hunger, guides your metamorphosis." Without waiting for his approval, Elira plunged toward the clearing. Her healer's instincts overrode every consideration of personal safety as she saw young David, Elder Matthias's son, fall beneath the claws of something that might once have been human, but had been twisted into a creature of pure predation. "Mira," she called out, her voice cutting through the sounds of combat. "Hold the circle!" The young woman's head snapped up, hope and disbelief warring in her face. "Elira, but we thought—" "I'm alive," Elira said, reaching the defensive perimeter just as another wave of shadow creatures surged forward. "But we need to get you out of here. Now." Theran appeared beside her like a force of nature, his supernatural speed and strength turning the tide of battle in moments. Shadow creatures that had seemed invincible scattered before his presence, recognizing a predator far more dangerous than themselves. But even his power had limits. More creatures emerged from the forest depths with each passing minute, drawn by the scent of blood and the weakening of ancient protections. "The barrier collapse accelerates," he called over the sounds of combat. "We have perhaps an hour before it fails completely." Elira helped Mira bind the wounds of injured villagers, her hands steady despite the chaos around them. "Can you get them to safety?" "Not all of them," Theran replied honestly. "Some are too badly hurt to move quickly, and the forest swarms with predators we haven't seen yet." As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed through the trees, the hunting cry of something far worse than the shadow creatures they'd been fighting. Whatever approached had enough power to make even Theran's expression grow grim with concern. "Cassius," he said simply. Through the darkness between the trees, pale figures emerged with the fluid grace of apex predators. Lord Cassius led a group of younger vampires, their eyes reflecting the blood moon's light like crimson stars. They moved with purposeful coordination, herding both the human survivors and the lesser predators toward the center of the clearing. "How touching," Cassius called out, his voice carrying easily across the battlefield. The great Lord Theran, reduced to playing shepherd for mortals who wandered where they don't belong. "Let them go," Theran replied, positioning himself between the advancing vampires and the human survivors. Your quarrel is with me, not with innocence. Innocence, Cassius laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. These mortals invaded our territory, disrupted our hunt, and now serve as perfect witnesses to what happens when humanity forgets its place in the natural order. Elira felt the weight of the silver chain in Theran's hands, understanding what he intended. The transformation ritual would need to begin soon. The blood moon approached its peak, and any delay would mean failure. But how could she abandon these people to save an abstract future when their deaths would happen before her eyes? The choice is simple, Cassius continued, his cold gaze fixing on Elira. Abandon your foolish ritual and watch these mortals die quickly, or proceed with your transformation and watch them die slowly while you're helpless to intervene. The cruel elegance of the trap became clear. Cassius had orchestrated this entire situation to force her into an impossible choice: personal transformation at the cost of watching her friends die, or abandoning the ritual to save lives that would ultimately be lost anyway when the barrier collapsed completely. Mira's hand found hers in the darkness. Elira, what's happening? What ritual? What transformation? There was no time for explanations, no opportunity for the gentle truth-telling that such revelations deserved. The blood moon hung directly overhead now, its crimson light bathing the entire clearing in the color of prophecy and sacrifice. "Trust me," Elira said, the soul-binding chain warming in her grasp as Theran pressed it into her hands. "And forgive me for what I'm about to become." The transformation chalice materialized in Theran's hands as if summoned by will alone, its silver surface catching the blood moon's crimson light and transforming it into something that pulsed like a heartbeat made visible. The ancient goblet's obsidian base gleamed with symbols that seemed to write themselves across its surface, responding to the cosmic alignment above them. "Now," Theran said urgently, as Cassius and his vampires closed their circle around the clearing. "The moon reaches its peak. We have moments before the window closes forever." Elira felt the soul-binding chain growing warm against her palms, its silver links beginning to glow with the same rhythm as the chalice. Around them, the battle had reached a strange standstill, shadow creatures retreating before Cassius's presence, while the surviving villagers huddled together in desperate confusion. Mira's eyes never left Elira's face, trust and terror warring in her young features. "What happens to them?" Elira asked, gesturing toward her friends, even as she accepted the chalice's weight. "If the ritual succeeds, the barrier renews and protects them," Theran replied. "If it fails, nothing in this world or any other can save them from what's coming." The liquid within the chalice seemed alive, swirling silver and darkness in patterns that defied physics. As Elira raised it toward her lips, she felt the weight of 4 centuries pressing down upon her. Seraphina's choice, her own choice, the endless cycle of sacrifice and loss that had defined their love across lifetimes. "I bind my soul to yours," Theran said, wrapping the silver chain around both their wrists. Where the mystical links touched their skin, light blazed forth, not the cold radiance of moonbeams, but the warm glow of shared hearts beating in perfect synchronization. In transformation, in whatever you become, let love be your anchor to humanity. Cassius's voice cut through the ritual's building power like a blade through silk. "Stop this farce. The age of human protection ends tonight, with or without your cooperation." He gestured to his followers, and they surged forward not toward Elira and Theran, but toward the defenseless villagers. The cruelty of it was perfect. Force the ritual's interruption by threatening innocence, then claim the barrier's failure as proof that vampire supremacy was inevitable. But Elira had spent 37 years as a healer, 37 years making impossible choices about who could be saved and who could not. Her hands remained steady as she brought the chalice to her lips, even as steel rang against claw and human screams echoed through the forest. For love, she whispered, her eyes meeting Theran's across the space between heartbeats. For duty. For everyone who deserves a chance to see tomorrow. The liquid touched her tongue like liquid starlight, burning and soothing in equal measure. Power flooded through her body, not the cold hunger of typical vampiric transformation, but something warmer, more complete. The soul-binding chain blazed, with such intensity that even Cassius's vampires paused in their attack, shielding their eyes from radiance that spoke of forces older than their understanding. Elira felt her mortal flesh reshaping itself at the molecular level, her heartbeat slowing and changing until it matched the eternal rhythm of Theran's immortal pulse. But unlike the vampires she'd feared from childhood stories, she retained her capacity for compassion, for love, for the fierce protectiveness that had driven her healing work for decades. The transformation completed just as the blood moon reached its absolute zenith. Above them, the cosmic alignment created a moment of perfect possibility, the instant when ancient magics could be rewoven, when covenants could be renewed or shattered forever. A symbol appeared above Elira's heart, glowing through her clothing like a brand made of light. It was the same mark that blazed on Theran's chest, the renewed covenant seal, proof that their eternal bond had satisfied the ritual's requirements while creating something unprecedented in magical history. The barrier didn't just renew, it evolved. Instead of the harsh wall between worlds that Seraphina's death had created, this new protection allowed for cooperation, for understanding between human and supernatural realms. The Covenant's magic recognized not sacrifice born of duty alone, but choice made in love's service. Cassius and his followers found themselves repelled by power they couldn't comprehend, their predatory nature unable to function in proximity to magic founded on protection rather than domination. The shadow creatures that had terrorized the villagers simply dissolved, their existence incompatible with the new order taking shape around them. Impossible, Cassius snarled, his elegant features twisted with rage and disbelief. The Covenant cannot evolve. The old magic doesn't permit such changes. The old magic was created by love, Elira replied, her voice carrying new harmonics that spoke of immortal depths. And love always finds a way to grow beyond the boundaries others set for it. She turned toward the surviving villagers, seeing wonder replace terror in their faces as they witnessed not the monster they'd expected, but someone who had chosen to become something greater than human, to better serve humanity's needs. The blood moon began its descent, but its work was finished. The renewed covenant seal pulsed with steady light on both Elira's and Theran's hearts, visible proof that some bonds truly could transcend death, time, and the limitations mortality imposed upon love's expression. Mira stepped forward hesitantly, her healer's instincts recognizing something familiar in Elira's transformed presence. "You're still you," she whispered in amazement. "I am more myself than I have ever been," Elira replied, reaching out to touch her apprentice's face with hands that now held the strength to protect what she cherished most. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and Elira stood in the place where it all began, the ancient clearing, where village tradition had offered her as sacrifice to powers beyond understanding. But this morning the space held no shadows of fear or death. Instead, it bloomed with impossible beauty. The eternal garden seeds that she and Theran had planted here grew into flowers that defied every natural law she had learned in her mortal life. Roses bloomed alongside spring daffodils, while autumn chrysanthemums shared space with summer lilies. Each bloom represented a moment of harmony between the world of the living and the realm of the supernatural, a visible reminder that love could indeed bridge any divide. "The delegation from the Eastern Territories arrives today," Theran said, joining her beside the fountain they had installed at the garden's heart. Water flowed in patterns that seemed to sing, carrying nutrients to plants that thrived on moonlight and memory as much as soil and rain. Elira nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to the renewed covenant seal that glowed gently above her heart. The mark had become a symbol of hope for human communities throughout the region, proof that cooperation between species was not just possible but beneficial. Village representatives from 12 settlements and 3 vampire lords who've agreed to establish protective compacts rather than predatory relationships. Cassius would be horrified. Theran observed with dry humor. Cassius chose exile over adaptation, Elira replied. Some refuse to grow beyond old patterns, even when those patterns bring nothing but suffering. She had no regrets about the former lord's departure. In the weeks following the Covenant's renewal, Cassius and his followers had been given a simple choice: accept the new order that protected both human and vampire interests, or leave the territories permanently. Most had chosen adaptation once they understood that cooperation could be more rewarding than predation. Those who refused had vanished into distant lands where old ways might still hold sway. A familiar figure approached through the garden path's mirror, carrying the same worn leather satchel that had once belonged to Elira. The young woman had proven remarkably adaptable to the new reality, accepting her mentor's transformation with the practical wisdom that made her such a gifted healer. The Blackwood village sends word that the fever sickness has broken completely, Mira reported, her face bright with satisfaction. Your new healing methods work even better than the old ones. Combined magic and traditional herbalism, Elira said, feeling deep pleasure at the success. Her vampiric nature had enhanced rather than replaced her healing abilities, allowing her to sense illness at levels impossible for mortal perception, while retaining all the knowledge gained through decades of practice. The integration of supernatural understanding with human wisdom benefits everyone. And the patients respond well to your presence, Mira added. Even knowing what you are now, they trust your dedication to their welfare. That trust had been perhaps the most precious gift of the past months. Instead of fleeing in terror when news spread of her transformation, the communities she had served for decades had embraced her continued protection. Children who had been afraid of vampiric legends now smiled when they saw her, understanding that some transformations were born of love rather than hunger. Elder Matthias emerged from behind a flowering hedge, his weathered face showing none of the fear that might have been expected when facing a supernatural being. The morning services went well, he reported. Father Benedict included prayers of gratitude for the renewed covenant in today's liturgy. Even the village church had adapted, recognizing that divine will could work through unexpected instruments. The priest had taken to saying that love, which survived death and transcended species boundaries, must surely reflect heaven's own nature. Any word from the capital? Theran asked. The king's scholars continue their studies, Matthias replied. They're fascinated by the historical implications, how many other legends might contain kernels of supernatural truth that could benefit the realm if properly understood. Elira smiled at that. Her transformation had opened doors to knowledge that had been hidden for centuries, creating possibilities for advancement that neither purely human nor purely supernatural wisdom could have achieved alone. The university in the capital now hosted the first formal courses in integrated studies, teaching physicians and scholars to work alongside supernatural beings for the betterment of all. A distant bell chimed from the direction of the village, and Elira felt her heart lift with anticipation. Today's gathering would establish protocols for expansion of the Covenant model, other regions, potentially protecting thousands more lives while creating new opportunities for cooperation and growth. "Are you ready?" Theran asked, offering her his arm with the same courtly grace he had shown 400 years ago. Elira accepted his escort, marveling at how natural it felt to walk beside someone whose love had literally reshaped the fundamental laws governing two species. The eternal garden seeds continued their impossible blooming around them, creating beauty that belonged to no single season, but to the eternal spring of hope made manifest. "More than ready," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of immortal depths while retaining all the warmth and compassion that had defined her mortal life. We're writing a new chapter in history, one where love conquers not through force, but through the courage to become more than we were. As they walked toward the village, where representatives from both worlds waited to forge new agreements, Elira reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begun as a widow ready to die, convinced her story was ending. Instead, she had discovered that some stories were too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime, too important to be limited by the boundaries between mortal and immortal existence. The blood moon would rise again in 3 years, but this time it would witness celebration rather than sacrifice, communities gathering to honor the covenant that protected them all. Vampire lords and human leaders meeting as equals to discuss shared challenges and opportunities. Love, Elira had learned, was indeed the most transformative magic of all. Not the desperate passion that demanded possession, but the mature devotion that sought the beloved's highest good, even when that required personal sacrifice. Such love could transcend death, bridge species, and reshape the very foundations of existence. The garden behind them bloomed eternal, a testament to second chances and the infinite possibilities that opened when hearts chose growth over fear.